Welcome to this week's episode of Beyond the Indus. I'm Joe Wallen.
And I'm Tushar Shetty.
We've got an action-packed episode for you this week. As always, it's been an extremely busy news cycle. So how are you this week, Tush?
So Joe, I know it's a bit of a meme that we always talk about the weather in our intros for Beyond the Indus, but I'm actually in a major cyclone at this point, Cyclone Biparjoy, which is currently barreling down the coast of Gujarat, as well as the Sindh province in Pakistan. And also, on a presumably unrelated note, it's Pride Month. So Joe, what have you been doing to celebrate?
So yeah, I've been up in Delhi this past week, so I'm afraid to say from my side, it's been rather quiet when it comes to celebrations.
Well, Joe, you might be interested to know that I actually went for a Pride event in Bombay, of all places. And it was quite interesting because it was a sort of a concert that promoted businesses that were run by folks from the queer community in Bombay. And there were a couple of things that really interested me. One of them was that this was very much a corporate sponsored event. So it's interesting that corporations working in India are promoting and financing these sort of events. I think that's a positive sign. But the actual concert was amazing. And I think the peak of this event was a singer who was singing a traditional Assamese love song that's sung by women to the returning men, I believe. And the way he sang it was absolutely perfect. It showed that even in traditional Indian culture, you can find this sort of easy existence between different sexual identities and gender identities, which I thought was quite interesting. But at the end of that song, he sort of quietened the audience down. And he said, guys, I'm from a state called Manipur, and Manipur is bleeding right now. So I want you guys to please pay attention to this story. So I think it's a good place to start this podcast this week by talking about the violence ongoing in Manipur. So the violence in Manipur erupted earlier last month between two communities that live in Manipur, the Meiteis and the Kukis. And the start of this conflict was basically a march that was taken out by the Kuki and other tribal communities against a petition in the Manipur High Court that allowed the Meiteis, who are the other community living in the state, to access certain special reservations and special grants that were granted to the tribal people living in the hills, the Kukis. And this violence, unfortunately, has spiraled out of control, with both sides attacking each other and burning down villages to the point where the Indian army has started deploying troops to quell the violence. Unfortunately, this has not worked, with increasing reprisals on both sides every time there seems to be even a little abatement of the violence.
In India, quotas are often given to marginalised community or marginalised groups within a community or a state. And what we saw in Manipur was that the Meiteis, who were the majority in the state, were seemingly offered quotas or benefits that other tribal groups in the state had. Smaller tribal groups have held protests about this ruling, saying they would squeeze them out of government jobs, public sector jobs, university places. And then it seems to have the violence seems to have really picked up from there, from these initial clashes, and doesn't seem to be ebbing. I mean, we had a sort of a brief week or so. It seemed to get an easy sort of ceasefire, and then over the last week we've seen several deadly attacks again, intercommunal deadly attacks again. Both sides, both Meitei and Kuki groups saying that they're not going to attend peace talks held by the Indian government, and pointing the fingers at the authorities and saying they're being complicit in the violence. I read a report in Scroll this week. An individual was quoted in there saying, how can our two communities go back to living side by side? And I think that's the concern for the Indian government, that they need to try and figure out a way that can continue.
While we should be clear that the majority of the residents from both communities who live in the state are appealing for peace, they are groups that are orchestrating occasional attacks, and this is leading to reprisals from the other side. So Joe, one of the things that I found really difficult about the story is, as I was following events, it became really hard to discern which side was doing what and what were the reasons for doing so. It just seemed that from the way reporting was coming out, that it was a jumble of chaos that had just erupted out of nowhere. And this might lead into maybe a question I wanted to ask you about media representations of events like this, especially violent events between two communities. So I was reading a bunch of different sources, and I was trying to find out, why is this happening? What is the cause of this? Being in media, right? You're a veteran journalist. You have some understanding of why media outlets do this, like obscure certain names or not provide certain kinds of information. So what's your opinion on all this? This idea of we shouldn't mention the communities that have orchestrated so-and-so event or such violence.
Yeah, do you know, mate, it's really interesting you say that because I had the exact same thought yesterday when I was like catching up on the news. It's mainly in the Indian press. It'll say like 2 people killed in Imphal, for example, and then it's kind of like, well, it doesn't go into detail, and you have to actually hunt around to find out what details are. And I wonder whether there's been some sort of like notes or pressure that's coming from Delhi that to try and not stir it up further, that they're not going to use like they're not going to say who's attacking who. So I wonder whether they're trying to kind of like play down like the communal side or trying to kind of like lower tensions. That would be my thought. And that.
So yeah, I mean, I think that's where the question of why does certain media outlets report things a certain way came from, because it doesn't help me understand what's going on.
Well, I think that's the thing, right? It's become, it's headline news now, but this hasn't come from nowhere, right? And the reports that I read and people I speak to all seem to say that, this is a spark, but there's been years and years and years of this tension building. So, I mean, what did you find when you were reading around?
So in the Northeast, it's been really difficult for the Indian state to control insurgencies because of the remoteness of the land, because of the different tribes that live there. And it's also a factor that Manipur, Nagaland, and Mizoram, they have a lot of tribal populations that stretch across into Bangladesh and to Myanmar especially. So what the government has been doing is that they turn a blind eye to certain activities in order to buy peace, which, considering the complexity of that situation and its history, I think it's completely understandable to some extent. But apparently that changed in 2021 because that's when the Myanmar coup happened in February. And the junta started cracking down on all the ethnic minorities, Rohingya being one of them, but also the Chin population that live on the border of India. And the Chin population is tribally related to Koki people in Manipur as well as the Mizo people in Mizoram. So they started fleeing into Manipur and Mizoram. So there's been evidence of increased numbers of people coming in because there's been crackdown on them. And then your friend's story about the increased amount of drugs comes in because there has been some evidence of increased poppy cultivation. I'm not saying any of this justifies what's happening there, but it helps explain why the situation has become increasingly destabilized. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. So we did a story a couple of years ago from Assam, where we actually went out with the Assam police. Several days on drugs and weapons raids with them. And the police are warning, this is I think about 18 months ago, that there was a massive influx of drugs and weapons coming from Myanmar through India's northeast, so through Mizoram, through Manipur, through Nagaland, Assam, and then to the rest of the country, the rest of India. So it doesn't, these reports don't surprise me. The concern of the police at the time was that militia groups kind of in the northeast of India were making a huge amount of money from this as part of the trade sort of in between Myanmar and the rest of India. And that this would have massive implications on safety and security in the northeast. And obviously this happened during COVID times, so eyes are elsewhere. I think we're seeing some of the impacts of that now. I think it's complicated as well. There are allegations that members of the Indian army are sympathetic towards the tribes in Manipur, whereas the police and the authorities and the state's chief minister are sympathetic towards the Meitei and those who are living more in the cities and on the plains.
Yeah, it does complicate things. And I think there was a report in the print from, I think, last year, which was talking about the process that they underwent to acquire an Aadhaar card, which is the identity card that, Indian citizens have. So the village council backs your application for the Aadhaar. So all you needed is a phone number to get the Aadhaar card. And then basically you're identified as an Indian citizen. This is what led the chief minister of Manipur, Biren Singh, to threaten to de-recognize some villages out there. Yeah, so it's the drug problem, but it's also if you have more people from, let's say, different ethnicity in a place that's known for like inter-ethnic conflict, then they also acquire more power democratically in the ballot box. I can see why that could lead to more tension on the Meitei side.
Definitely interesting and important to mention. The point you say about people coming into the state from outside and it driving this drugs trade. Because we did a piece it was like Mizoram, Assam, and it was just like the increase in drug trafficking, seizures, production in northeast India the last 2 years had like skyrocketed. But then I need to kind of qualify that by saying that reporting is limited in the area that because it is not one international publication is allowed into Manipur, and that's certainly been the case since I've been in India in 2019. When you look at even the coverage in the Indian media, there's very few outlets that seem to have anyone on the ground. The pieces in Scroll were quite standout because they were really on the front lines, as it were. It'd be impossible, I think, to do the podcast this week without talking about the horrific train crash in Odisha's Balasore district. Now, the death toll has increased to about 288, and around 100 people are said to still be injured. Immediately, it led to a lot of criticism about the country's train network, which has rapidly expanded. It's about $29 billion announced this year for India's railway network in the budget, which is a 50% increase on last year. So by 2030, the Indian government would like 45% of its rail network to be transporting freight, so not just passengers. So there is massive hope on the network being a huge driver of economic growth. And, safety records have massively improved. In 1980, there were 2.2 accidents per million kilometers traveled, and this has improved to 0.05 in 2019. So it is obvious that things were going in the right direction and are continuing to go in the right direction. But I think the questions that are being asked in the long term, with this $29 billion investment this year in the rail network, how much of that is going on safety and how much of that is going on new lines, rolling out these high-speed intercity Vande Bharat trains that have had a lot of publicity. And I think that's the legacy of the crash, that more money needs to be pulled into the day-to-day running of the system. We've seen several reports come out since freedom of information requests that show there have been several near misses this year, where trains were sent onto the wrong tracks and narrowly missed others, some because the driver's saying that they had to act, kind of very quickly to avoid a crash. So it is evident that there are safety issues within the system. Certainly short staffing seems to be a problem. That the Hindu reported in January there's around 300,000 positions open that needs to be filled. If India's rail network is going to expand as planned, it will need a vast number of employees as well to ensure that the system is safe. And I think the crash in Odisha has shown that things aren't quite perfect, or certainly aren't perfect at the moment.
I've been looking at some of the stats that came out, and I think what makes understanding these incidents in the broader context a little more difficult is that, the Indian Railway always had a lot of structural problems. It always had problems with safety. It always had problems with staffing. It got understaffing. Then it had problems with a wage bill that didn't allow it to invest in increased capital outlay, which is basically increased tracks, increased amenities, stations, etc. I was looking at how many people die on the Mumbai Suburban Railway every year?
10,000 people
a year,
maybe a bit less than that. A couple of thousand people.
Yeah. 10,000 would be a bit of a massacre, wouldn't it?
I think it's probably quite high.
Yeah. It's 2,500 people a year, which is 8 people a day in Bombay, the richest city in India. What was interesting for me was that, you've heard of this whole Kavach scheme, right? This new safety mechanism that the railway minister, Ashwini Vaishnav, has deployed.
Yes, there's been a lot of excitement about this Kavach system. I think it was announced in 2019, I believe, yeah.
Unfortunately, even if that system was in play in this in the sector that the Odisha accident happened in, apparently it wouldn't have stopped the accident because it was a track signaling issue that was a problem, right?
Yes, so there has been a lot of criticism with regards to the Kavach system, which has only been deployed on around 2% of India's rail network to this date. What the government has done is they've deflected criticism of the crash, I think, very swiftly. There's an investigation ongoing from India's Central Bureau of Investigation, and fingers seem to be being pointed at an individual or an unnamed group of individuals. The indication was that this is a human error. This isn't a problem. This wasn't a problem from a lack of infrastructure or a lack of safety. We've seen this before with other similar, I think, events in India. With the bridge collapse in Gujarat last October, November. Again, that was blamed on individuals rather than endemic structural corruption. Again with COVID, I think given the number of deaths that we saw in India, it was remarkable that Prime Minister Modi came out of that more popular than ever. But again, I think the government did a very good job of painting these crises as sort of supernatural or external events that the government simply has no control over. And I think that's what we've seen again in the aftermath of the train crash in Odisha, that this is being pinned on a rogue elements or rogue group of people, and there's nothing that the government could have done. I think as well the fact that it's going to take, I think, a minimum of 180 days for the CBI's investigation to be made public. By then, the news cycle will have moved on so far that it's unlikely that I think the findings of that investigation are held too much to account. What I can say is that the incident certainly hasn't dampened, public demand for rail travel. The ticketing platform IRCTC So there's been no impact in the days that followed the crash when it came to rail bookings. I think if you look now, if I go and try to book a train from Mumbai to Delhi, for example, I'd struggle to do so for the next 5 or 6 weeks. So there's certainly, I think public confidence hasn't, or perhaps public necessity in travel certainly hasn't dipped since the crash. And also the other major story, I think, breaking from South Asia this week was the long-awaited Pakistan budget. The country is on the brink of default. Negotiations continue with the IMF. And there were high hopes that the budget might lead to some kind of long-term structural reform. But what we've seen presented is essentially a populist budget by the incumbent government with its eyes on the autumn general election, rather than one that's going to bring about this long-term change. There's been no tax reform, which is one of the terms the IMF was calling out for. No major industrial reform either, but we've seen hikes to government salaries, hikes to minimum wage in Pakistan, and an even greater fiscal budget this year. Now, Pakistan's economy, when you look at the budget, around 97% of tax collection this year is going to go on meeting external payments. So Islamabad is planning to borrow yet another further $25 billion over the next year simply to keep the country running. But it can't keep borrowing and borrowing. Allies like the Saudi Arabias of this world, China, the UAE, they're getting to a point where they're saying enough is enough, that they can't keep matching Pakistan's requirements. So I think following that general election in the autumn, there is going to have to likely be a new budget, a completely fresh budget made by whoever comes into power with an eye on the next 5 years, because reform is necessary for the country's economic survival.
It's a couple of things. It's interesting because from what I've been reading about Pakistani Finance Minister Ishaq Dar, is that he is a bit of a Nawaz Sharif or Shehbaz Sharif party loyalist. He understands, how to handle the party, but he's not really an accomplished economist to say the way Miftah Ismail is. So he's been attracting some sort of flack for that. The other story that got me really interested was the story that Pakistan received their first delivery of Russian oil. It's not significant as compared to, let's say, how much India imports. I think we get somewhere like 30% of our oil requirements right now met by Russian crude. But what's interesting is how they paid for that oil, which is through renminbi. Even though a lot of their debt is still in dollars and they're going to have to figure out a way to handle that. The fact that Pakistan is now using the yuan in order to buy Russian oil, it could be like a template for other countries that, are under sanctions or closer to China, and so you see this area of China, Russia, Pakistan, and perhaps even Iran, that might create the foundation for like an alternative to the dollar-based or the dollar-dominated, international trade system. So that was really interesting for me, as we're looking into the whole Modi story.
So for this week's episode, we're focusing on a story which is set to dominate headlines. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi will arrive in Washington, D.C. on Wednesday for a 4-day state visit, the first time an Indian leader has been granted this honour since Manmohan Singh in 2009, when he was invited by then US President Barack Obama. Now, during this jam-packed visit, Mr. Modi will address a joint session of the US Congress for the second time, becoming only the first Indian leader to do so. He'll have a state dinner hosted by US President Joe Biden and his wife Jill, meet with the US State Department, and he's still finding time to lead celebrations at International Yoga Day.
So this is a hotly anticipated visit. President Biden himself has joked that everyone in the whole country wants to meet Modi, and he's not wrong. US-India relations are seemingly at an all-time high, united by shared strategic goals in the Indo-Pacific, including, of course, stemming the rise of China. While the visit is also set to announce a number of new defense and manufacturing deals, which could mark the most significant agreement between the two countries since the 2007 India-U.S. civil nuclear agreement. It's no wonder that The Economist's lead story is a picture of Joe Biden hugging a tiger with the title America's New Best Friend. But what really is the significance of this visit? Is it just an orchestrated photo op by Prime Minister Modi looking for a political boost to his home constituents? Or is it a genuinely paradigm-shifting visit that might change the trajectory of India-US relations for the next decades to come? Stay tuned. It's a pleasure to be joined this week by Dr. Rajeshwari Pillai Rajgopalan, the director of the Center for Security, Strategy and Technology at the Observer Research Foundation, one of India's leading think tanks.
In a glittering career, Dr. Rajgopalan was the technical advisor to the United Nations group of governmental experts on the prevention of arms race in outer space and the non-resident Indo-Pacific Fellow at the Perth US Asia Centre. In between these achievements, Raji finds time to write a weekly column for The Diplomat on Asian strategic issues and has authored a cool 9 books. Welcome to the podcast, Raji. How are you today?
Thank you so much for having me on this podcast. I'm good. The visit is an exciting sort of a phase. So there's a lot of to talk about and to unpack in a sense in this podcast, I think. Thank you.
So, Dr. Rajgopalan, I wonder if you could help contextualize how far India-U.S. relations have come. Because although they seem to be going strong right now, with both countries having increased strategic and defense cooperations through both Republican and Democratic presidencies, this wasn't really the case for most of India's independent history, was it? The two countries found themselves on opposing sides of the Cold War. And as recently as 1998, President Clinton didn't hesitate to impose sanctions on India following his nuclear tests. So I'm curious to understand when and how did that change? And in particular, who are the figures that helped transform the US-India relationship from the Cold War bickering to the sort of bonhomie that it's experiencing today?
Yeah, that's a terrific question to look at because when you look at India-US relations, they have not always been the best. But I would also add that they were not uniformly bad either, including during the Cold War years. And I think the US, for instance, came to India's help during the 1962 Sino-Indian border war. And I think that's a remarkable episode in India-US relations that were otherwise fraught with a lot of problems during the Cold War years. And of course, India was the largest recipient of the US foreign aid during throughout the Cold War period. So there's a lot of positive things, a lot of good things have happened during the Cold War years, but that history is often forgotten. Then, of course, the relations hit a low in the early 1970s with the Bangladesh war, for instance, and the U.S. support for Pakistan. That really brought the U.S.-India relations to an all-time low. But the U.S.-India relations began to sort of pick up, began to improve by the 1980s. Then again, of course, the next major milestone in terms of looking at the relationship from a negative aspect is when President Clinton did impose sanctions on India following the 1998 nuclear test. But again, these were removed fairly quickly, and there were also a certain amount of effort on both sides to understand each other, to listen to each other, what is kind of driving these issues in a sense. And I think that led to for the first time, at least for India, to engage in a strategic dialogue. So the Talbot, Jaswant Singh strategic dialogue that had 14 rounds of strategic dialogue that happened led to significant improvement of the ties, culminating with President Clinton's visit to India in March 2000. So, and then, of course, from then onwards, it's been further opening up happened. The signing of the next steps in strategic partnership initiative happened with the two countries wanting to kind of explore, agreeing to expand cooperation in 3 specific areas. They were looking at civil nuclear activities, civilian space program, and high technology trade. They also agreed to expand their dialogue on missile defense. And I would say further, the subsequent governments have kept up with this momentum. So I would say the Vajpayee-Clinton governments laid the framework for the bilateral relationship, and the subsequent governments have taken forward this momentum since then. Bush administration had a big role to play in this, in the transformation that we have seen in US-India relations. Both the Bush administration and the Manmohan Singh government in India, the signing of this US-India nuclear deal. Manmohan Singh government did face some difficulties because of the coalition government. But for that matter, even the BJP tried to oppose the nuclear deal. But this had more to do with the domestic politics than any questions about the relationship with the US. I think since at least President Clinton, I would say there has been sort of a keen interest in building up India's relations with the US. That's been a priority. So in that sense, now the Modi government has kept up with that strong support for relations with the US. He has kept up with that momentum that we have seen so far. So I'm not sure that I can take up some individuals who were particularly key. But if I have to, I would say Vajpayee, Clinton, the two governments in the US and in India, they really made the difference in terms of laying out the framework for the kind of relationship that we have seen between India and the US.
And that's really interesting because to my mind, it was always the Bush-Manmohan Singh sort of nuclear deal where that relationship really jumped out to me. I mean, that was something I grew up with. It's interesting that it was a BJP government again, that of Vajpayee and his foreign minister Jaswant Singh, that sort of really took that step forward after the sanctions were applied. it does seem that Mr. Modi now is taking another key step forward with India-U.S. relationships more than previous governments have, let's say.
There is. I think the relationship with the U.S. is a key priority area for both the international politics perspective, as well as from a domestic politics perspective. And I think there are also the structural reasons, in a sense, structural conditions that have been created. The kind of balance of power politics that we see both in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. I think those structural conditions are pushing India to do what is pragmatic review of India's foreign partners, who are those security partners who can actually help India with India's challenges and so on and so forth. So in that sense, when you look at it, Modi is keeping up with that strong support that we have seen from early 2000 onwards, and clearly the structural conditions, the changing balance of power equations in India, in the Indo-Pacific and beyond are actually providing additional imperatives for the Modi government to take that relationship forward, in a sense.
So we've mentioned Manmohan Singh a couple of times so far on the podcast, but the last state visit from an Indian Prime Minister to the US was Manmohan Singh himself in 2009. Now, my sources tell me that Mr. Modi has been pushing for quite some time for a state visit, as you mentioned, given these warming relations between India and the US. I mean, how important has this been to them, or how important is this for the Modi government to have this state visit to the US? And how has Mr. Modi contributed to these improving relations?
No, good relationship with the US is a high priority. Again, like I said, both from a foreign policy perspective, as well as from a domestic politics perspective. Being partners with the most powerful country in the world is also seen as a sign of successful Indian foreign policy. So definitely important for Modi to show that he has a very strong partnership with the United States. Contributions by Modi specifically, I would say it's more or less the same as the previous prime ministers. But of course, Modi has built on what others have done. But I wouldn't say there is anything dramatic. There's nothing dramatic about what Modi has done, but a lot of continuity from what others have done so far. So steady progress, but there is no dramatic change in the Indian foreign policy. Modi has built on the same directions, built on the relationship in the same manner that others have done before him. So I would say a lot of continuity that we see. But again, I think the structural changes in international politics at this point of time has given a lot of visibility to what India is doing. So the visibility aspect is something that we are seeing a lot more than any big departure in terms of India's foreign policy, India's approach to the United States, and so on and so forth. So it's a lot of continuity, but there is also necessity of the times driven by the China factor. The China dimension in India-U.S. relations cannot be ignored. To build that closer strategic partnership with the U.S. has become a key priority for India because of the China factor.
It's interesting you mentioned the China factor there, because I think that this is really key when we come to looking at contemporary relations between Delhi and Washington. What are the two countries most keen to collaborate on? I mean, we talk about China, but what other areas of interest do they cross over on?
No, I think China is the most critical factor when you look at the India-U.S. relations, because it's not that U.S.-India relationship, they have been strengthening over a period of time. But even in the U.S.-India nuclear deal, it's not that the U.S. suddenly recognized there is a need for clean energy and so on and so forth. I think they had the strategic factors pushing the Bush administration also to look at how can we build, how the U.S. can build stronger relationship with the U.S. came from the fact that there is a big China factor that needs to be addressed. And for that, it is better to India have on the U.S. side than otherwise. India might play a neutral player otherwise, like the non-alignment sort of movement of India. And that is something that I think they clearly wanted to avoid. But I think the China-driven questions are at the front and center of the India-U.S. relationship. They might develop a lot of other aspects to the relationship, whether it is in terms of developing closer defense ties. And I think that also comes from the Russia factor. That's other big factor that has been on and off in terms of sometimes it has created a bit of tension in the relationship, but it has not really damaged the relationship. For instance, when India decided to buy the S-400 air defense systems from Russia, how would that impact on the India-U.S. relations if the U.S. were to impose, for instance, the CAATSA sanctions? So there were a lot of questions, doubts about how things might unfold in that way. But there was also the huge significant constituency in Washington, DC, also that talked about the fragility of the relationship. And if the US were to impose sanctions on India, the CATSA sanctions on India, I think India is going to be, in some sense, lost because India will not come back to. There has always been the question of the US: how credible is the US as a security partner, and kind of thing. And if the US were to impose sanctions, then that would be a huge setback for the relationship. So I think the different administrations, the Trump administration and of course the Biden administration, the different administrations have seen how fragile the relationship is at one level. It's very strong, but at the same time, it's also fragile because of some of the factors like Russia. And I think many of the strategic analysts in both US and India have written about the fact that, for instance, if India has to be able to reduce the dependency on Russia, then there has to be Western supplies of defense technologies to India, because otherwise, where does India go to? So I think there has been that political recognition on the part of the US to some extent, I would say, in recognizing that unless the US or other Western partners are able to meet India's defense requirements in giving technology, engaging in technology transfer and so on and so forth, India will continue to have that relationship with Russia. So if the Russia relationship, the Russia factor has to come down in overall India's dependency on the defense sector, it is the responsibility also in some sense of the West, especially the US or other European powers, to step up their cooperation with India so that India's dependency on Russia can be minimized. So therefore, strengthening US-India defense cooperation has become an important aspect of the US-India evolving relationship.
Absolutely. I think we've had a lot of conversations this week regarding the announcements that have been coming out of the US in the lead up to the visit. So we're looking like a collaboration when it comes to aircraft engines through General Electric, Predator drone sales possibly coming from the US to India. We've seen Germany and India in discussions over submarine sales.
Right.
There seems to be motion in place for sort of more support from the West when it comes to military hardware. I believe last year France actually overtook Russia as India's number one.
Right.
A source of hardware for the first time in some years. So as you say, that process is very much underway.
No, I think there has been conscious effort on the part of India also over the last decade, slightly more than a decade, to diversify India's defense trade partners. So India has been making that effort for a while now. But again, given the kind of dependency on Soviet Union first and now Russia for something like for several decades, there are legacy systems that India continues to buy from Russia, and it's not easy to kind of wean away from Russia overnight. So it is taking time. So I think when you look at the next decade, India's most procurements are coming from non-Russian sources. That's something that I've heard and seen in various closed-door conversations. So there is a conscious decision by India in the past decade to move away or at least reduce the dependency on Russia. That the dependency on a single source, Russia has been a problem. And now with the Russia-China relationship growing ever stronger, I think India has to make some very difficult choices in terms of moving away from Russia, provided some bit of technology transfer happened in the earlier decades. Second, I think it was relatively cheaper. I think that's another big consideration as to why India continued to buy the Soviet and Russian systems, because they were also cheaper. And because given the overall defense budget allocation of India, the cost factor is always an important consideration. And therefore, India did look at Russia as a feasible option in many ways. But I think given the kind of Russia-China interactions that are happening, I think that is going to be an aspect because of which now India will need to speed up or accelerate the process of defense trade diversification.
So, Raji, it's interesting when we talk about the defense cooperation aspect of it. But I guess my question is, where else, apart from defense cooperation, do you see the India-U.S. relationship going in the next, say, decade or 20 years? Which avenues do you think is going to continue to strengthen? And, you've spent some time in Taiwan, so I'm particularly interested in the economic side of this, because the one single factor that helped the East Asian tigers to industrialize, including China, was access to the U.S. consumer market. And recently, it seems that the US is increasingly turning inwards. So India may not have the China deal, so to speak. So where do you see this relationship going on that broader framework over the next 10 or 20 years?
So the way I see it, I think the relationship over the next decade or two will, of course, continue to strengthen. But it will depend on a couple of different factors, because I look at it primarily from a security or strategic perspective, because I think that is the, you may have trade and economic, other investment opportunities and so on and so forth. But will that really sustain the kind of momentum that we are seeing? I'm not entirely sure. I think it's a strategic security aspects that are driving the relationship with such kind of positivity. But again, it will depend, for instance, on one, because we have had very cold relationship in the past, but never really adversary. So it depends on one of the factors to look at is, for instance, how the China relationship evolves in a sense in the future. If China has peaked as of now and it is now in a sort of a declining sort of a trend, both India and US will need each other less than what we see now. But if China continues to grow, continues to be this hegemonic power with aggressive sort of a posturing use of with somebody who uses force around against all of its neighbors and others, then I think that you are looking at a condition where both the US and India will need each other, will need to work with each other much more than ever before. And also in terms of the kind of what kind of international system are we looking at? Are we looking at a bipolar global system that is emerging? And China as a pole is not going to be an option for India. So again, the US-India relationship could become much stronger as we go forward. So I think there is a lot that is going to weigh on the China factor. If China were to become, for instance, a much more benign, accommodative power, how would the India-US relationship look like? Even at this point of time, forget about 20 years from now, but at this point of time, if China were to become a more accommodative power, being accommodative about India's security concerns, India's sensitivities and kind of things, how would that relation... I'll tell you, just to give you an example, in Doklam, for instance, the conflict happened between India, China, and Bhutan, the transaction of that particular region in 2017. The conflict lasted for about 71 days. Finally, there was a disengagement of forces that happened after 71 days. Thereafter, the two sides went to do sort of a high-level discussions, what were called the informal summits. So two informal summits happened, one in Wuhan, and a second time President Xi came to India for another summit. Many in India wanted to believe that the Doklam conflict was more of an aberration and that it was not something that China was really calculatively doing it against India in a sense. That conflict was not it was not planned, but it was more of an accident, more of an aberration in a sense. That's what the Indian establishment wanted to believe. Even when the informal summits happened post-Doklam, there was a lot of sort of a narrative that was being created in India to say that this is a sort of a giving way to a reset in the relationship and so on and so forth. But some of us who were, I certainly have been a skeptic even at that point of time. And I have written several articles even during those years to say that this is the kind of China that one should be prepared to deal with. The Doklam was not going to be just the last one. This is just the beginning of the China aggressive China that you're going to see. And therefore, you will have many more Doklams. I wish I were wrong about it, but 3 years later, you had the 2020 Galwan conflict. So, and during those 2-3 years in between post-Doklam, when the informal summits were happening, India, for instance, was already engaged in the Quad 2.0, but we wouldn't even call it Quad by the name. We would say this, complicated sort of a name, saying that US, India, Australia, Japan grouping met. We wouldn't even call it by the name of Quad because we were so sensitive to how China would look at that and so on and so forth. So we did everything to ensure that China relationship did not get affected negatively and so on and so forth. So if China were to become slightly more of an accommodative power and be sensitive to India's concerns, India's sensibilities, I think, a lot could change. But I think the Galwan conflict surely has done a lot of damage to the relationship. So to me, a lot of the, much of how I look at the US-India relationship in the coming decade or next 2 decades, I think it's going to depend a lot on the China factor and how the world might look like and that. So if China were to become, which in my view is going to be the case, China will continue with its aggressive posturing, the belligerent mode, and we might end up with a bipolar situation. And in that situation, in that scenario, unlike in the past Cold War, India does not have the option of playing one against the other. India cannot really be partnering with China, being an immediate neighbor, but at the same time with a neighbor with whom there's a huge historical baggage, with whom there are unresolved border and territorial issues. India really cannot be partnering with China. So the option for India remains then, it is the US, that is the US and US allies, US partners that are going to continue to remain India's new security partners also. So in the coming 2 decades, I think much of the relationship is going to be driven by the China factor. But I think in terms of the avenues of cooperation, I would look at, for instance, defense and security arena, critical and emerging technologies. These are the major areas that will see major progress in the coming years. But of course, we will continue to look at some of the other aspects, because India is also trying to be the, sort of a leader of the global South, providing a voice to the global South. So India will continue to raise issues such as developmental issues, climate change related issues, and how some of the many island countries are going to be affected. So India will want to champion the cause of the global South and so on and so forth. So we might take up those issues, but I think that primarily the relationship is going to be driven by the security, strategic, and defense areas in a sense.
Yes, I think the areas for cooperation are going to be numerous. I mean, we look at announcements over the last couple of weeks. We've seen the US saying that it will send kind of experts to India to help start or to kind of encourage or grow the semiconductor industry, which I think is quite exciting for India. You know, we've seen Tesla in talks to open a factory in Gujarat, Apple and Amazon in the country over the last week or two. There seems to be huge kind of business interest in India at the moment, for sure, in the US. I mean, how significant are these recent deals? And do you think we can expect to see more in the future, as you say, kind of across defense, manufacturing, when it comes to things like AI? There's a huge amount of, I think, cooperation between the two countries.
There are enormous possibilities. These are all possibilities that will possibly unfold in the coming years. But we wouldn't know until these happen, because many of these have been in the works for many, many years. So in some sense, I'm a little bit of a skeptic. So we'll need to wait and watch. Not because there is no interest on either side. There is a lot of interest on both sides, especially looking at the semiconductor issue or looking at the supply chain resilience issues, or AI and other critical technologies, drone, a whole range of issues. There's a lot of interest in India as well as in the US to kind of partner with India. But again, India, does it provide the same kind of incentive as China did 20 years ago, 30 years ago, provided the best incentive for the world to come make investment there, manufacture things, and so on and so forth? Is India doing that? Even 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when we talked about companies, factories moving out of China, and India was offered an enormous opportunity. There was a major opening up for India. India could have cashed in on that, but India did not really gain much from that. Most of the Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, these are the countries that are actually benefiting. They are providing the best incentive for the rest of the world to come and set up their shops, set up their factories, and so on and so forth. So India has issues still that need to be resolved, whether it is in terms of the investment climate, whether it is in terms of the manufacturing climate, whether it is in terms of providing appropriate infrastructure, continued water supply, continued power supply, land acquisition. All of these are issues that India still need to resolve. So there is a lot of possibilities, but I am not counting the chicken as yet. I am going to do a bit of wait and watch. Because even when you look at some of the political issues, with India, everything takes time. We took about 10 years to sign some of the defense foundational agreements with the US. I know there is a huge amount of history. We have different histories, different contexts that we have come through, and so on and so forth. So signing on to some of the defense of foundational agreements were not going to be easy. There's a lot of what if and so on and so forth when India signed something with the US. It did take some time. But the fact is that that's a reality that you're dealing with. With India, everything is going to take time. So how soon? We signed a semiconductor agreement recently, but there was a question, somebody was talking to one of the US bureaucrats about this, and the response was, yes, we haven't even really come to thinking about what is that we are talking about. We haven't even developed that common shared understanding of what is that what we want to do. So I think there is interest, of course, and India is very, very ambitious in wanting to partner with the US and with the rest of the major partners on an array of technologies and so on and so forth. But again, how quickly is India able to do that? What kind of an incentive structure is India creating in order to make these things a reality? I think that's something that I will say I will wait and watch.
We've spoken a lot about China, and it does seem apparent that this seems to be the overriding factor that's pulling India and US into closer relations. But I do want to talk about the so-called bear in the room, and that's the Russia relationship. When the Ukraine war started, I remember the initial response from US officials was almost something of dismay, because I think they did expect a bit of a stronger reaction from India, given the growing US-India friendship. And I just wonder where that relationship is going. And do you think that this state visit and the increasing closeness between, the US and India would lead to an increasing decoupling with Russia, particularly in the area of defense?
So decoupling with Russia, I would say it's already on the way, because, and not necessarily because of the US-India relationship or the Ukraine conflict. And Ukraine conflict, of course, yeah, the US-India, the US partners, and many other India's new security partners, the US, Japan, Australia, and several other countries were, in a sense, stunned by the Indian response, because they did expect India to get on board when the Ukraine is a fellow member UN country, and that country's territorial integrity, sovereignty has been violated. It's as simple as that. And how is that India was not going to get on board with a resolution when it came up to the UN? So that was kind of because I think these are the issues, these are principles that have remained important, critically important for India, given the kind of neighborhood that we live in, given the kind of neighbors that we have with the two neighbors, Pakistan and China, and with both of whom we have continuing sovereignty and territorial integrity related issues. So it must have been fairly shocking to a lot of India's new security partners as to how India did not really come up with a stronger response. One aspect about India's response in that in the Russian-Ukrainian invasion of Ukraine is that, one, India does not generally call out countries by name. That if you go back and look in the UN documents, UN's sort of Security Council resolutions and kind of thing, we usually don't call out countries by name. So that's an Indian practice. Again, I'm not defending that, but that's the Indian practice in a sense. So one, we don't call it. Second, I think the second factor that India was very concerned about is, of course, defense dependency on Russia. That is something to the tune of 70 to 80%. That's a really large proportion of the Indian defense inventory that you're talking about. 70 to 80% of Russian component in Indian defense inventory, that puts a lot of pressure. And especially at a time when India is still in an active live conflict with China on the border, India is too sort of wary of what if India took a stronger response made a stronger response on the Russian invasion or called out Russia by name, if Russia were to stop the supplies of certain defense platforms, or what Russia were to sort of stop the maintenance of some of the platforms, or does not do the repair and so on and so forth. So or does not supply spare parts and kind of thing. So a whole host of worries, of concerns of that kind really did come into play. But my sense is that my counterpoint to that is, Russia does not have too many friends at this point of time. Would Russia want to lose India as well in the process? And second, I think India should have its own confidence. India should deal with Russia with a lot more self-confidence, because we are the ones we are buying this a huge amount of weaponry and defense platforms from Russia. So we should have that kind of confidence to pull off something like this. But again, that's Indian establishment does not really have the habit of calling out Russia by name. But the more other important aspect is the strategic sympathy that exists for Russia, that started out for Soviet Union and then which continues even now. That comes from a lot of the historical background, anti-imperialism. Then as the Cold War politics picked up, it became anti-West, anti-US. That also translated to, in a sense, pro-Soviet sympathies, strategic sympathies for the Soviet Union. And that has not really gone away. Even now, the strategic sympathy among the most larger public in the country as well as within among the political class, within the parliament. You can take a vote, and nobody would say that we can abandon the Russia relationship as yet. So the strategic sympathy that exists for Russia is something significant, both at the larger public level, but also at the political level. But I believe India's relationship with Russia will change because of the China factor. That's going to be the determining factor in the change that we might see in the India-Russia relationship in the coming years. One, I think the Ukraine conflict, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, during this conflict, it's come out quite clear that Russia's weapons technology is not as good as they used to be. So that's number one, and therefore I think that's one set of one factor that is going to be a natural reason for why the India-Russia defense relationship will change. Second, the fact that the China factor is going to be another important for the change that might happen, because Russia today is supplying much better, more advanced weapon platforms to China than to India. This was not the case for much of the history, but over the last decade, this equation has changed, and for Russia, China has become the all-important strategic partner, friend, and so on and so forth. And to them, strengthening that China relationship has become the most important priority. And for that, if they have to sell the most important, most advanced technology to China, they will do that. So to give you an example, after the last Ukraine crisis started in 2014, Russian President Putin went to Beijing in 2014 summer. He signed 2 weapons deals. One was for the supply of advanced Chinook-class submarine. Second was for the supply of Su-35 fighter jet. India has bought Su-30 MKI, and we deployed on the Sino-Indian border. Now Russia has gone and given to China a more advanced platform, affecting the military balance between Russia, India, and China in a direct manner. So I think these are the kind of realities. It is slowly sinking in India that there are material consequences. There are implications for India's national security calculations. The kind of actions that Russia is taking today vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis India, it has material consequences. It has national security implications. So I think this is beginning to change. So India-Russia relationship will change, but not necessarily because of the growing US-India ties, but more because of the China factor and how that has emerged as an important determining factor for India to kind of review and change its defense trade partnerships in a sense.
That's fascinating. And to me, that recontextualizes the entire debate about, India needing to maintain relations with Russia because India wants to have an independent foreign policy. But the bigger question is, do we want to outsource our advanced defense manufacturing to a country that's effectively beholden to our greatest strategic rival, China? So that does really put that into question, yeah.
Absolutely. So that is something that is really, I've been so puzzled. I'm like, how is that people sitting in the Ministry of External Affairs or Ministry of Defense not getting this? Somebody is supplying a better platform to my enemy. How can that particular country be my partner? Today's the Russia relationship is a liability, strategic liability. Second, when you touched upon the strategic autonomy, which is the mantra in the Indian foreign policy narrative, there are 2 things actually. So one aspect is about, if anybody studies India, they would know that India will not change the Russia policy at this point of time, because India will not want to be seen as coming under pressure from the West, from the US or anybody else, and therefore changing the policy. So India's policy towards Russia will change, but not at this point of time, because we don't want to be seen as changing our policy towards Russia under pressure from somebody else. Second aspect is that one of the goals of Indian foreign policy is also to have good relations with all the major powers. And to India, it seems like Russia is still a major power, and with also China. Despite the fact that we have 150,000 troops on the border, on both sides of the border put together, we are still looking some semblance of normalcy in the relationship. So there is an active conflict. There are 150,000 troops. Despite that, India still looks for some semblance of normalcy in the relationship with China, some semblance of good relations with Russia continuing. But so that's one of the key goals for India, that we should have good relations with all the major powers. To me, that's a bad recipe, because at the end of the day, when you have a real conflict and when you want to look for who are your partners who are going to come to India's aid, Russia is certainly not the answer, because China has become the number one national security threat for India, as the late CDS General Rawat put it. But the fact is that who are those countries? Which are those countries that are going to be helping me in managing the China problem? Is Russia going to be the answer? To me, that answer is very clear. Russia will not be on your side, on India's side, to manage the China problem. Is the US going to be on your side? Yes. Is Australia going to be on your side? Yes. Japan? Yes. Vietnam? Yes. Singapore? Possibly yes. So there are France? Yes. So I need to look at which are my most important national security challenges, and which are those security partners of mine who are going to be with me in managing the threat. To me, it seems like very crystal clear, but the Indian establishment does seem to have a slightly different view in how they look at. They believe that having those good relations with all the major players is going to be helpful in managing whichever security challenge that you're trying to deal with, in a sense.
So it's interesting because, India the defense establishment might have its blinders on when it comes to how much Russia is going to back us in the end. But perhaps I could raise a question as to what extent the US is going to do the same. Now, you're going to head to DC soon, and it's already election seasons because in 2024, they're also going to have their presidential election. And it's, possibly President Biden is going to continue, in which we'll probably see a continuation of the trajectory that's going on right now. But there is a distinct possibility of, a Republican successor, possibly the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, or even, amazingly, Donald Trump, who might come back. And, we've seen that this sort of India-U.S. relationship seems to have acquired a bipartisan energy, the same way that their policy in decoupling from China is also sort of bipartisan. But you also saw Trump make a lot of worrying noises about the U.S.'s role in the world and the extent to which it should play a role in international affairs, right? So what changes do you anticipate if in case, let's say, a figure like Trump came to power in the next presidential election?
So with Trump, I think there was a certain amount of improvement in the relationship. We did make some progress on the US-India relations. But Trump was also very mercurial. There was a certain amount of unpredictability about the Trump, in a sense. So one day India is the greatest country and greatest democracy, greatest all of that, great. And the next day, Trump was imposing, slapping India with a lot of different tariffs and so on and so forth. So there is, you went from one end to the other within a span of days with the Trump administration, with President Trump. But the administration still did manage to make some progress. We did make some important changes during the Trump administration. So even during the Trump administration, which generally has had a lot of countries around, at least in the Indo-Pacific, were not entirely comfortable with the Trump administration, primarily because it's the unpredictability and unpredictable nature of the U.S. administration. You're not really able to say how the U.S. is going to play on this particular issue, etc., etc., etc. But I think that's something that is, when the Biden administration took office, I think there was a big relief in the Indo-Pacific, at least among a lot of smaller countries in the Indo-Pacific, which felt that now the U.S. is back to a certain amount of predictability. We can talk about and we can see how the U.S. is going to deal with issue A, B, C, D, and so on and so forth. So I think that's a generally kind of thing. But a possible Republican successor, we don't know. DeSantis, we don't know a lot, other than a general opposition to international engagement. That's more of a sort of other isolationist tendencies and so on and so forth. But I think what the candidates say during the campaign is one thing, and once they come into office, it's a very different reality that they need to deal with. So at this point of time, it is difficult to say how things might look at. But like you said, there is generally there is certain amount of bipartisan consensus on both China and India. China is a threat and India is a partner. I think that bit of bipartisan consensus does exist at this point of time. And we have seen steady improvement in relationship, irrespective of whether it is a Democratic or a Republican administration that is in office. because of the strategic convergence, broad strategic convergence that we have seen over the past close to 2 decades now, and also the structural changes that are happening in international politics that are pushing for a closer relationship, irrespective of who is in office, irrespective of ideology, irrespective of any of the historical issues and so on and so forth. So I would think, irrespective of who comes into office, there is likely to be a lot of continuity going forward because of the structural changes that are happening, the balance of power politics that is happening. And therefore, even India is going to go into elections next year, but most likely it is going to be the BJP that is going to come back into power. But even if a Congress government were to come into power, I would not see a change in the approach as far as the U.S. relationship or Japan, the Quad, all of those relations are concerned. Because we did have, at the end of the day, U.S.-India nuclear deal was signed by a Congress government on the Indian side. So I think as far as the foreign policy issues are concerned, and as far as the relationship with the U.S. is concerned, there is a lot more continuity. It is a bipartisan consensus that we have to build closer relationship with the U.S. And the same exists in the case of the U.S. as well. Irrespective of who is in office, I think the consensus that exists for both China and U.S. China has become a competitor, a threat, whereas India is a partner, and with a partner that we need to continue developing closer partnership and closer relationship.
No, absolutely. And you mentioned Mercurial, and I still remember that beautiful campaign ad that Trump put out in 2016 on Diwali, in which he said, quote, I love India, I love the Hindus, and then he ended it by saying, Ab ki bar Trump Sarkar, which is quite presumptuous of him. But I think you're right. There's one thing we know about Trump is that he's probably not going to go soft on China. So I guess we can hold him to that expectation.
Exactly. So I would say, even, without being an ally, India-U.S. relationship has come a long way, has grown enormously thanks to the China factor. So the primary driver of the relationship, which is China, and that relationship has therefore continued to expand, deepen. Look at the number of areas that we partner with each other, whether it is in bilaterally or through unilateral groupings and so on and so forth, the kind of military exercises that we do. So there is a lot that is going on, and I think that would continue to be the case. We are still wary of joint operations, joint military planning, and so on and so forth. But I think that's a work in progress that will come hopefully sooner than later with the kind of changes, structural, strategic challenges that we see in Asia.
So, Joe, that was a fascinating interview. And I think one aspect of it we didn't really discuss is how Mr. Modi is using this visit in order to further his own domestic political aspirations. So the one thing that is interesting about Modi is that he is one of the few prime ministers to effectively use foreign policy as a political tool to shore up his own popularity. And I think that makes the timing of this visit quite interesting, particularly in the lead up to the 2024 elections.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's wonderful optics for Modi and the BJP, following that election loss in Karnataka, where a couple of questions were asked about the BJP's, election-winning machine. And I think having Mr. Modi meeting Mr. Biden and being received so warmly in the US is going to cast a lot of those doubts away that amongst the electorate here, or the majority of the electorate here, that he is the man to take India into the next election and to run the country for the next 5 years.
I think talking about the geopolitical aspect of this, I was looking for historical examples because the post-World War II NATO Warsaw Pact order is a bit of an aberration when it comes to historical international relations from a historical perspective, right? Because it's very rare that you find so many major economies or countries, bound together in a tight alliance like this. Most of the alliances tend to be very issue-based. Like, for instance, have you heard of the Concert of Europe, which was the order that was instituted after Napoleon's defeat in 1815?
I haven't, mate, to be honest. You're much more of a history buff than I am, but come tell me.
Yeah. So in that order, basically you had your 5 great powers, Prussia, Austria, Russia, France, and Britain, who decided to maintain a balance of power where they all agreed that if any single country decided to destabilize that order by, say, attacking another power or to seize too much control, the other powers would sort of unite and either declare war, impose sanctions on that country to deter it from, being too ambitious. And we saw that in the Crimean War, where you saw basically Britain, France, and Austria, 3 countries that have historically not really been on friendly terms, all decide to attack Russia because it was being too grabby in the Balkans, for instance. So I was thinking that this might be one of those things where the depth and strength of Indo-US ties are going to be reflected by how aggressive China is with its international ambitions. And I do think that post Xi Jinping, if you saw a return of, let's say, the politics that were played by Hu Jintao, who was a lot more passive, was a lot more, let's say, committed to stability and international order, I could see that the US-India ties waning and waxing depending on how China behaves.
Now, the limits and the facets of this relationship are going to be tested in the years and decades to come. The extent of Indian support for the US in the Indo-Pacific is something that at the moment is open to debate. While India is keen to safeguard its border with China along the line of actual control and maintain its dominance in the Indian Ocean, hypothetically, if China was to go to war over Taiwan, including the United States, where would India stand there? There are a lot of unanswered questions despite the warming of this relationship.
Yeah, only time will tell in what direction this relationship is going to develop. And on that happy note, I think it's time to end the episode.
So thank you all so much for joining us on this week's episode of Beyond the Indus. And we look forward to speaking to you again soon in a fortnight's time.